Urban Cultural Studies,
the podcast.
Interviews.
And welcome to Urban Cultural Studies Podcast. Today our guest is Matthew Lamb, who is a lecturer at Penn State University. He is an urban communication scholar whose interests lie in understanding architecture as communication, focusing primarily on architecture's influences in the production and maintenance of culture in urban environments. His doctoral dissertation on parkour, architecture, and the body was a finalist for Distinguished Dissertation of the Year Award for the Critical and Cultural Studies Division of the National Communication Association. Welcome to the program, Matt. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Ben. I'm honored to be here.
Now, I've just read your article. It is titled Misuse of the Monument,
Yes.
The Art of Parkour and the Discursive Limits of a Disciplinary Architecture. There's a theoretical side to this article having to do with architecture, urban space, and the body, but also an element of, there's a practical side. When I think about this, I keep coming back to the word exercise. But first, tell us about the word parkour, which figures in your title.
Sure. And let me start by saying that my pronunciation of the French language is rather poor, but I'm going to do my best. And so the word parkour comes from parcours du combattant. And those were the obstacle courses used by the French military. They were used to train soldiers in the 1960s. And part of its inspiration came from Georges Iber's method naturel, or his natural method. And it was founded on the maxim that to be useful, one had to be strong. Iber was a naval officer, and so he came into contact with a large range of people. And in particular, he seemed to be drawn to the people of Africa and the people of the Caribbean, and that's where he spent a good deal of his time. And he was stationed in French-occupied Saint-Pierre in Martinique, where he spent a lot of the time simply observing the people that were there. In 1902, the island was hit by a volcano, and Iber himself coordinated the evacuation effort of around 700 inhabitants of the island. And it was that experience of the volcano and the evacuation and seeing people essentially relying on the strength of their body to flee for safety, it sort of left him with this belief that to be useful, you needed to be strong, but you need to be strong in body and in mind as well. And so he went on to develop this natural method, which was training people to be strong of body, but also to develop their sense of place.
Yeah.
And in that, he was using the body in combination with the environment. And so essentially, the environment becomes your gym. And you use what's available to develop a strong, a fit body in the same way you develop your mind so that you're never confined or stuck or even at the mercy of, say, something blocking your way, like when lava is raining down from the sky behind you.
Yeah.
So what's really interesting about all of that, I think, is that parkour is really an inspired or a modern version of Iber's natural method.
Lava raining down on you, that's certainly a great motivation for doing exercise.
Yeah.
There's some French-derived vocabulary here that might be new for listeners. Parkour, traceur. Tell us about these terms.
Parkour, with the C-O-U-R, roughly translates to a way or a path. So parkour with the K is this sort of using the trained body to find the most efficient way or path through the particular environment that you're in.
Okay.
And often it's just succinctly described as finding the most efficient way from point A to point B without being stopped by anything in your path. And it just so happens that what we know now as parkour is practiced mostly in urban areas. And the people who do parkour are called traceurs. And the traceur, they take this idea of moving through your environment without being stopped by anything because something's in your way or in your path.
Right.
And they apply certain moves like running, and jumping, and vaulting, even climbing. But it's whatever the situation calls for. So, for example, if you're doing parkour and you come up to an obstacle, say a low wall, it's in your way, right?
And you can't go around it, or better yet, your mindset, as you said, is that of being in tune with the environment.
Exactly.
The environment is no longer an obstacle for you.
You can jump it or climb it or vault over it. And so you have to make split decisions about what to do. And a lot of that decision is based on your environment, but it's also based on your ability. But you can be even the most advanced traceur and still be dependent on what the space gives you. And I mean, you can't walk through walls, and tracers, they do from time to time, especially while you're learning, they fall But if you're doing parkour in a super tight-knit space, you may need to kind of tap into your skills of jumping or holding or climbing. But if you're in a more open space, kind of like the monument I talked about in the article,
Monument Circle in Indianapolis.
you may need to be doing more running or balancing or vaulting, for example. And so your decisions are based on the space. They're maybe not dictated by it, unless you're like on top of a building, for example. That would kind of dictate that you wouldn't want to fall off of it or jump down to your death.
No.
But certainly I would say your choices and moves are heavily influenced by the spaces you're in. You have to sort of sync up with the terrain to be in unison with it. It's almost like a dance partner.
Can you give us some examples of how parkour is practiced? Where might parkour be seen? What is involved?
Well, if you've been exposed at all in recent years to popular culture, you've most likely seen parkour being practiced. I tell people they probably know about parkour, they just don't know that they know. And I usually say something like, you've seen these people running across the roof and jumping from building to building or vaulting over the walls or the stairs. And at that point, they can usually reference some example from the media or on YouTube most commonly.
Right. I'll add that where I live, I just saw a locally produced television commercial for a law firm where the check payouts to clients, the checks are delivered by someone practicing parkour, it seems. Nothing slows them down.
Well, it seems to be everywhere because it continues to gain a lot of pop culture momentum. It's been in movies like the first Bond film with Daniel Craig. In that movie, he's actually chasing Sebastian Foucault, one of the co-founders of parkour.
Ah, is that right?
Yeah, that's him in the opening of the film. He's doing parkour to get away from Bond. And on top of that, it's in several advertising campaigns for K-Swiss, Pepsi, and it's in a lot of music videos. There's a big music video by Madonna that came out several years ago that features parkour pretty heavily.
Huh.
And I think its visually stunning moves are perfect for action movies or advertisers to grab our attention.
All right. So it seems parkour is about exercising twice over. That is, exercising the body and exercising what otherwise might be called the right to the city. Both of these at once.
Right.
This is something we haven't yet spoken about, but in my view, a central premise of your article is that architecture and the body, however you want to phrase this connection, the built environment and the urban dweller, the city and the citizen, they're all intertwined. There's a great philosophical legacy implicit in making this connection, which I believe parkour allows us to think through if we so choose.
Yeah, I agree. But I like to start simple when I think about this connection because it reminds me of when I was a kid. And growing up, my family didn't have a lot of money, so my brother and I shared a room. And my mom had a way she wanted our room to look. But mostly that meant she wanted it kept clean and our beds made, toys put away, the normal stuff.
Sure.
And later we took the bunk beds apart so we could have two beds, two individual beds. And from time to time, my mom would let us move those beds around however we wanted. And my brother would usually keep his bed in the proper place, square to the window with the foot of the bed directly in line with the door. And on my side, I didn't have a window. And if I did have a window, maybe I would have just left my bed in the same place all the time. But I would push my bed sort of perpendicular to my brother's so that the beds made a T. It was just to be different from him. He was keeping his bed perfectly aligned. And as a kid, it was fun to kind of tease my brother and get power out of something that was ridiculous. But technically, I had permission to do it. And I bring this up because it's a good example of how we sort of implicitly understand ourselves in direct connection to our environment. But what's more is how, even at an early age, without really knowing what I was doing, I was using the physical environment as a way of communicating something about myself and the power that sort of controls, if you will, that space.
Okay, you've given an example from childhood, but of course there are many out there, and I'm thinking, as usual, of critical geographers and urban theorists. I've worked most with the works of Henri Lefebvre, David Harvey, who sustain that the built environment of the city is also a way of communicating something, and that part of that communication has to do also with who has the power
Definitely.
to shape and to reshape city space, and who in fact does not have that power. Lefebvre in particular wanted to recapture spaces of the city for play.
I think parkour does give us a glimpse of the ludic city. Parkour allows us to kind of peek into what is taken for granted in the physical environment and think about it more playfully or creatively. And while buildings ultimately can't tell us who we are, they can represent the power we become subject to.
Right.
So parkour in a lot of ways makes us confront and recognize just how complicit we become in obeying these sorts of signals coming from the physical space of the city. So it comes down to a kind of, so what's architecture got to do with it? And I think just like me moving my bed as a kid, it kind of works in reverse. So instead of an individual organizing space to say something about themselves, we get city leaders, planners, architects, businesses building and organizing city space so that we get a sense of who they are and what they value. And ultimately, I think what they expect from us when we are kind of in their metaphorical room moving their bed.
Something that strikes me, you don't mention this in the article, but I think it might serve as an interesting contrast, and you alluded to it earlier in this interview. Listeners may be familiar with base jumpers. These are people who climb up buildings, many times in urban areas, and drop off with special parachutes outfitted for drops of relatively short heights.
Yeah.
How would you contrast that base jumping with the exercise of parkour? Is there a different philosophy at work? Is there a different relationship between the individual and the city being expressed in each case?
I think so. And I think in some ways this sort of city as a tool for self-expression theme can link them up for sure. I mean, jumping off a building that you're not really supposed to be on would, in my mind, it would be a form of misuse as described in the article. But in that sense, parkour shares similarities or finds a lot of common ground with other art forms or sports that use the built environment as a playground. And what comes to mind first is Russian climbing. A quick search on YouTube will give you an idea of what this is. But visually, it looks to the uninitiated eye, it looks like parkour. But tracers will be quick to point out that Russian climbing is more like free running, which is a kind of spin-off of parkour, and was championed by Sebastian Foucault, we talked about earlier in the Bond film. And it pays more attention to the kind of fancy or the more visually stunning moves. So in parkour, a tracer might simply jump down from a ledge or a landing and jump down to the ground, whereas a free runner would probably do a flip to land on the ground.
Yeah, I see.
And on the one hand, you've got a move that is efficient and fast, and on the other, you've got a move that is sexy or flashy that gets oohs and ahs.
I'm beginning to think that law firm commercial I saw was more on the Russian climbing side of things, actually.
And that may be. If it's in an advertisement, it's most likely that or free running because of the more exaggerated moves. Another one that comes to mind is bouldering, which is like bouldering, but with buildings. So climbers that can't or won't go out to the woods to climb boulders, or maybe they're just up for a new challenge, they'll climb or boulder on buildings. So you've got plenty of examples of people using architecture to challenge themselves and push themselves to see what their limits are and try to get past them. But really, amongst all these examples, parkour is relatively the new kid on the block. And, I mean, it's been around, at least in France and parts of Europe, since the 80s. But this using of architecture to play or push with your limits is hardly new.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. I think what separates all of these is their intention or their guiding philosophies. And honestly, I'm not sure what motivates people to base jump off of buildings with a tiny parachute. I have a lot of respect for those guys. But in parkour, it's about sort of becoming or developing of the mind and the body. In doing my research and actually being in and around parkour for the last several years, I found that tracers seem to really devote themselves to parkour as a lifestyle. And now, I mean, granted, you do have some kids who just think it's cool and they want to try to jump off of something and emulate what they've seen on YouTube or in a movie. And ultimately, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. If the sheer joy of being able to use your body to learn more about yourself and your environment, I'm all for it. But the more devoted tracer, they follow this like a martial art. And I'm sure base jumpers could describe the same type of lifestyle devotion. But I'm willing to guess their spiritual connection with the act is found in the rush or the danger of the jump, whereas in parkour, the ultimate sort of enlightenment is to develop the parkour vision and achieve a kind of perfect harmony in motion with your environment.
This is to go back a bit to the literature review section of your article, but I think the way you draw out 3 themes from the existing scholarship on parkour is very helpful to those out there who may not have seen or read much about this. Can you briefly run through those 3 themes for us?
In my research, I noticed that the body of parkour scholarship has developed 3 major or overarching themes. There's room for interpreting other sorts of themes. I just categorized them this way because I was looking to find some sort of commonality in the literature. And it's some pretty brilliant stuff. My hat's off to the parkour researchers. And the first major theme sees parkour as an antagonist to capital.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is, if we break that down a bit, antagonize is an act in opposition to, and capital, which is capitalism, or the day in and day out processes that allow capitalism to function. And so the easy target in that process is, of course, working and shopping.
Consumption.
You're expected to go to work so you can buy things with those wages. And parkour does neither, really. So it acts in opposition to how capitalism is maintained in city space, this production and consumption process. And so traceurs are doing something in opposition to what allows capitalism to function and really flourish.
As Lefebvre might have said, they are using the city as a place for play. They're engaging the city not as an exchange value or a tool in the process of capital accumulation, but as a use value or a lived space for whatever use they can imagine.
Which is directly connected to the second theme in the literature, which is the idea that parkour subverts emotional or environmental constraints. So city life is increasingly directed toward the consumption aspect of capitalism, and we see the city as a great hub of theater, restaurants, tourism, attractions, and it's all set up for people to kind of consume these experiences. And the result of which, in some ways, is that you have a hard time thinking about what else we could do in or even with the city outside of those sort of production consumption activities. And so it seems like that's how doing city life should be. So we get environmental constraints from that. Now, the idea of subverting emotional or environmental constraints is really pretty important. And to me, it's pretty fascinating. So parkour subverts or undermines how overbearing these constraints can be. Those in power want you to conform and consume the experiences that they're working really hard to provide you. And inherently, there's nothing wrong or evil about that. I don't think there's some wizard behind a curtain. But parkour helps us think about the playful or creative, the leisure, even pleasure opportunities that come from a kind of going against the grain. And that grain being the production-consumption binary.
And the third theme.
Yeah, the third theme I found was how power is codified in the built environment. So if we think about what that means, to codify is to arrange codes, say laws or rules, and to code them or arrange them systematically. And so to arrange the codes of power in the built environment, we could simply say that architecture represents to us the rules that we should follow in urban space.
Here, of course, you bring Foucault into the discussion in your writing.
In the article, I'm thinking specifically about rules for movement, as in where we can go and what expectations there are for how we move in and around architecture. Now, sometimes that's really easy. There are signs explicitly stating, keep out or private property, but sometimes it's a bit more subtle. And a lot of times, a church looks like a church, or banks look like a bank with their neoclassical columns and even super modern glass facades. And government buildings, they look like government buildings with their huge, brutalist-style exposed concrete. And these are just a few quick but easy examples. But you already have a sense of how you're supposed to move or act in and around those spaces. So what this theme in the research is pointing out is that buildings represent to us, to the public, these societal rules or these expectations of us.
Yeah.
Or perhaps what the owners or, whoever's in charge of that place expect of you when you're there. And the scholars talking about this approach essentially argue that those communicated expectations, they limit how people move and how we get around, and by limiting our movements, in many ways, you're limiting our thinking.
Thanks for being here, Matt.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's really been a pleasure.
Matthew Lamb's article, Misuse of the Monument, the Art of Parkour, and the Discursive Limits of a Disciplinary Architecture, is published in the Journal of Urban Cultural Studies 1.1, 2013. Also be sure to check out Self and the City, Parkour, Architecture, and the Interstices of the Knowable City, which is an ethnographic piece investigating through parkour architecture's role in how we understand ourselves and others in relation to the city space. He is also currently finishing a co-authored piece with Dr. Corey Hillman of Central Michigan University titled The Ultimate Quest, the Rhetorical Body and the Discourse of Fit at Tough Mudder. Remember that you can access the Journal of Urban Cultural Studies in both print and online formats through Intellect Publishers. And make sure to follow our multi-authored blog for more urban discussions at urbanculturalstudies.wordpress.com.